Hello friends, Jeff here with House of Heresy, and back again with another deck tech video where we're going to take a look at one of my commander decks and kind of break it down, talk about the different types or the different themes within it and the different cards I put in there. Kind of go from there. I'm by no means an expert, 100% not. I just do this for fun, so I'm sure I'm missing lots of cards, especially this deck in particular. Probably haven't put as much time into it, at least the construction of it, which I'll talk about in a moment, as most of my other ones. But that's where I love getting all the feedback from. So if you guys have some suggestions or whatever, different cards, different ways to maybe different directions to take. I know that this one has a couple different ways you can focus on. And the direction that I want to do is unfortunately limited by the amount of cards that I can use with that theme in particular. Just in general, I've been playing Magic since the mid-90s, since the Ice Age block, and I have taken many long breaks. So I am missing a huge slew of Magic knowledge when it comes to individual cards. So I'm sure there's tons that I don't know anything about. In fact, there are far more cards that I have never heard of, never seen, never touched than I have, just from the amount of time that I've not been playing Magic in those years in between. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so this is going to be a deck built around Sefris of the Hidden Ways. So she's the one of the precon commanders from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, the first D&D set that Wizards put out. And this is pretty much a modified precon, which is why I said I didn't put as much time into it, because I didn't build this one from the ground up. There's a lot of the cards, like the core of it is still the precon, I believe. I built this a long time ago, and I break it out every now and then. Usually I talk about the power level at the end, but I'll just go ahead and say right in the beginning that this is not a super powerful deck, because it's built around the precon, and it's not one of like the high-end precons from like the Commander, what was that, 17 or 18 with the Eminence era, or the ones we've had more recently, which have actually been very strong, like the Warhammer 40,000 and the Brothers War precons have both been great. This is not so much. Not that it's bad, it's just not super strong. So this deck, I mean, I would probably, just because I have some good cards in here, I'd probably push it to a 7. I'll let you guys kind of be the judge of that if you think that that's an accurate one or not. But in general, like, this is not meant to be a powerhouse of a deck. This is, you break it out when you're playing with a slightly above precon level, or you're playing against some of the really good precons. You're not trying to absolutely annihilate your opponents if you have like some newer players, or you and your friends are just taking it down a notch. So Sefris, this is, like I said, this is out of AFR, and one of the big mechanics in AFR that they introduced and sort of dabbled with, kind of, in Baldur's Gate, is the dungeon mechanic, and that's what I really wanted to do. I wanted to play a deck that kind of focused more on that. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of depth in it. It's kind of similar to like the foretell mechanic in Call Time. It's one of the more recent ones. Unless you're playing 5 colors and that's what you're focusing on, you're probably not going to get the full benefit as you would from like playing a tribal deck or playing one of the big, well fleshed out themes like artifacts or enchantments or something like that. So let's go ahead and get into Sefris real quick. So she is white, blue, black for a 2/3 legendary human wizard. And she has, whenever one or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, venture into the dungeon. This ability triggers only once each turn. And then you have Create Undead. Whenever you complete a dungeon, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So the two main themes that I have seen this deck go, outside of just playing it as a precon, is, let me rephrase that. The main theme that I've seen it played with is mostly revolving around the reanimator or reanimation mechanic. You really don't see like a true like dungeon delving deck, because it's really hard to do, especially with only 3 of the 5 colors, and really just using this. They did add the initiative into Baldur's Gate, so there are ways to integrate it, and I haven't really done much with those cards in this deck since I built it, just because it's slightly different, and frankly, I this deck is fun enough without like totally tweaking it, but I might revisit that at some point because I do enjoy the dungeon side of it. So basically, so let's talk about that real quick. So the way the dungeons work is, for those that don't know, because this set's been out of standard for a little while now, and people might not be playing with it, is in AFR there were 3 dungeons, and when you had a card that let you venture into the dungeon, you picked one of these 3, and you started at the top. And then as you played cards or triggered abilities that let you venture into the dungeon, once you're already in one, you're in it until it's complete. So you don't get to go venture into a different one while one's already active. And as you can see with some of these, we'll look at Tomb of Annihilation just because it's on top here. So you start it with trapped entry, so each player loses 1 life. Then the next time you do it, you get to choose. You can either go to Veils of Fear or Oubliette. So if you do Oubliette, then this is a 3-step dungeon. If you take the Veils of Fear, then it's a 4-step dungeon. Because once you're in a dungeon, you have to stay in. Once you're on one side, you only get to progress through the rooms. You can't go backwards. So let's say that we're going to take the left side there. So after we venture into the dungeon, we get Veils of Fear. Each player loses 2 life unless they discard a card. Then the next time you venture, you would get Sandfall's Cell. Each player loses 2 life unless they sacrifice an artifact, a creature, or a land. And then finally, regardless of which direction you went, you would reach the Cradle of the Death God, where you would create the Atropal, a legendary 4/4 black god horror creature token with Death Touch. Now this one in particular doesn't have a lot of payoffs except for you getting to create a 4/4 at the end there with Death Touch. It might be beneficial for you to ping everybody or people discarding cards or whatever. But you look at like probably the most common one used was Lost Minds of Phandelver, just because even if you have a 1-off, you get to scry 1 out of it, so that's pretty solid. But this one, like you're scrying 1, then you're either creating a token creature or a treasure token. Then you get to put a 1/1 counter, or each opponent loses a life and you gain a life, or target creature gets -4/-0, and then finally you reach the end and you draw a card. And then the last one, just since we're going through these, the Dungeon of the Mad Mage is the longest of them. And you get to gain a life, scry 1, then you can choose to create a treasure, or target creature can't attack you. Then you come back together again to scry 2, and then you can either exile the top 2 cards of your library and play them, or create 2 1/1 black skeleton creature tokens. Then you get to scry 3, and finally you get to draw 3 cards, reveal them, and you may cast one of them without paying its mana cost. So you have some degree of control over when and how these are triggering, because first of all, you get to pick. Second of all, there's not really any, I can't think of too many, actually I really can't think of any situations where your opponents can compel you to venture, unless they're like, I guess they could theoretically flicker one of your creatures to force you to venture at a time when you might not want to. But that's going to be few and far between, and that's like a pretty niche bit of deck tech to counteract what is not considered to be a particularly strong mechanic. But with that said, if your deck is built around trying to go through these, then obviously which dungeon you pick is important, and then what effects you intend to get at the times that you would like to get them are just as important. So it does require a little bit of forethought, because ideally you would want to complete them, because when Sefris once you've completed it, then you can start recurring your creatures. And once you complete a dungeon, the next time you venture, you get to pick again. So you could spend the whole game going through the same dungeon over and over again, or you could pick all 3 or any combination thereof. So if your purpose is purely just to complete dungeons, then maybe picking one of the fast ones is better than getting all the payoffs out of the Dungeon of the Mad Mage or something like that. Unfortunately, the real downside to this card, what really probably holds it back more than anything, is that you only get to trigger this once each turn whenever one or more creature cards are put into your graveyard. Because ideally, you would want to be able to trigger this a bunch, and it doesn't let you do that. So that's I think one of the main reasons why this is not a particularly strong precon, even though it's fun. I think it's fun, at least. I like the mechanic. I know a lot of people were really down on the whole dice rolling side of it, and the dungeon, the amount of the record keeping for the dungeon side wasn't super exciting. Although it did see some degree of standard play. You saw people at least getting to that scry one in some of the, from what I remember from like watching the arena championships and stuff back then. I feel like that there was some dungeon delving or dungeon diving going on there. But all right, let's get into the rest of the deck. So the first pile here is specifically cards that want or that get payoffs or enable you to enter the dungeon. This is actually the guy that I wanted to build a deck around, but there's not enough cards outside of him in particular that would enable that. So this is Acerak, the Archlick. He's a 2 generic and a black for a 5/5. Pretty cheap for a 5/5, but he does have, in some cases, what would be considered a drawback, but in our case, an enabler. So whenever he enters the battlefield, if you haven't completed Tomb of Annihilation, which is the first dungeon that we looked at, return him to your hand and venture into the dungeon. So as long as you don't ever complete that, you can just keep, for 3 mana, it's basically 3 mana venture, 3 mana venture. And then, finally, assuming he does stick, because you have completed that, then whenever he attacks for whenever he attacks for each opponent, you create a 2/2 black zombie creature token, unless that player sacrifices a creature. So he helps generate a bunch of zombies. If you're playing in like a 4-player pod, you get 3 each attack phase, assuming that he doesn't, each of your attack phases, assuming they don't sacrifice a creature in response. So this is a nice enabler. 3 mana to venture isn't terrible, especially if it's synergizing well with the rest of the deck. But like him as a commander, it would be a little bit tough because you would really just be relying mostly on him to do all the dungeon diving. All right, then we got Yanti Malison. It's a 1 generic and 1 blue for a 2/1 snake rogue. Can't be blocked as long as it's attacking alone, and then whenever he deals combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. So this is a fairly reliable way, as long as you're not swinging with a bunch of creatures or more than just this creature, for a fairly reliable way to again venture into the dungeon. And that's what we want. We want to try to maximize the ventures that we can, in at least so that we can have the most control over when and how we're progressing through and completing these dungeons. Because ideally, like if we were able to, doing the Dungeon of the Mad Mage and then getting to play a card for free every couple turns is pretty strong. It's just getting through the dungeons quickly is the real challenge here. And as you can see, this is not a thick stack of cards, so it is a very small percentage of your overall 99. So that means that you need these to repeat often to get the most value out of them. Then you got the Midnight Pathlighter for 2 generic and a white and blue for a 2/3 human wizard. Creatures you control can't be blocked except by legendary creatures, which is pretty good. That's definitely a combat enabler. And whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, venture into the dungeon. So if you have him on the board and you're only swinging with Yuan Ti, you would get 2 triggers, assuming that they don't have a legendary creature to block you. So that's pretty good. That's definitely helpful. We got the Triumphant Adventurer for a white and a black. You get a 1/1 human knight with Death Touch. As long as it's your turn, the adventurer has first strike, which makes people a lot less likely to block him. Whenever he attacks, venture into the dungeon. So this is an attack trigger, not even a deal combat damage trigger, which is better because at least you're guaranteed to get that trigger even if he dies in almost every situation. Then we got Barrowin of Clan Under for 2 generic white and black. You get a 3/3 dwarf cleric, and whenever he enters the battlefield, you get to venture into the dungeon, which is nice. And whenever he attacks, you can return up to 1 creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield if you've completed a dungeon. So he's got a very similar effect to Sefris, just with slightly different colors. So she's a little bit. Adding the blue is quite helpful. Otherwise, this could just as easily be the commander, and probably would be more reliable because of the ETB effect there. But we like the extra color because that gives us more options. And we got Radiant Solar, which is 5 generic and a white for a 3/6 angel with flying and lifelink. And whenever Radiant Solar or another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, venture into the dungeon. And then you can pay 1 to discard Radiant Solar to venture into the dungeon, and you gain 3 life. So this is another good enabler. It is expensive, 6 mana. No, I mean, for a precon, that's pretty normal. Like, that is well on par with the way most precons are constructed. But for a normal game against like a regular deck, like a power 8 or 9, 7, 8 or 9 deck, this is a little bit on the slow side. But for whenever any non-token creature enters the battlefield, that's super helpful. And that's not restricted to one trigger a turn, so that's quite nice. Nadar's Selfless Paladin for 2 generic and a white. You get a 3/3 Dragon Knight with Vigilance. Whenever he enters the battlefield or attacks, you venture into the dungeon, and other creatures you control get +1/+1 as long as you've completed the dungeon. So you'll see as we go through this, there's definitely a decent number of these cards that have payoffs for completing a dungeon. So the sooner you do that, the better the better things will go for you as you progress through the game. In terms of like getting the most out of these cards. But he's another strong one because the ETB and then the attack trigger is pretty solid. And for only 3 mana, not too shabby. Hama Pashar Ruin Seeker, sorry. 1 generic, a white, and a blue for 2/3 human wizard. Room abilities of dungeons you own trigger an additional time. So this means that whenever you enter into a dungeon, or enter into a room in the dungeon, whatever effect it has will trigger twice. Not that you get to go through the dungeon faster, it just, you get the trigger abilities multiple times there. So that's, obviously without having something to venture into the dungeon, this card means nothing, but it's a great enabler for the rest of the deck there. So that's it for the creatures. We have some other card types that allow us to venture into the dungeon. So you got the Delver's Torch, which is a white and a generic for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, and whenever equipped creature attacks, venture into the dungeon, you can pay 3 to equip it. So obviously not the strongest equipment ever. The 3 equipment cost is a little bit pricey, especially for a 1 getting +1/+1, but letting any of your creatures attacking being able to venture is quite nice for if that's what you're trying to do with the deck, as I am. Then you get the Immovable Rod, which is a 1 white mana artifact. You may choose not to untap Immovable Rod during your untap step, and whenever Immovable Rod becomes untapped, you get to venture into the dungeon. Then you can pay 3 and a white to tap it, and for as long as Immovable Rod remains tapped, another target permanent loses all abilities and can't attack or block. So there's definitely choices to be made with this card. If you are using the activated ability, then chances are you want that creature to not become untapped or gain its abilities back. However, it is if you have the mana available, then you could untap it during your untap step and then immediately pay again. The downside is that for that period of time, it allows them to get their abilities and stuff back. So, but still a very good card for what we're trying to do with this deck. And we got the Dungeon Map, which is a 3 mana artifact. It's a mana rock, so you can tap it to add a colorless, or you can pay 3 generic to tap it and venture into the dungeon, but you only get to activate it as a sorcery, so a little bit limiting. 3 mana rock is not great, but being able to venture into the dungeon could be helpful. And then finally, Thorough Investigation for 2 generic and a white. It's an enchantment, whenever you attack, investigate, and then whenever you sacrifice a clue, venture into the dungeon. So you would not be getting, theoretically you could get after, well, really, as long as you play this in your first main phase, you could be venturing into the dungeon every turn off this card, assuming you have a creature that can attack. So, okay, so that covers the dungeon diving aspect of it, the venturing there. The other part to this, and what more people tend to focus on with Sefris, from what I've seen, like with other people playing it, and then what I've read online, is as people tend to go more into the reanimation side of it. So you complete your dungeon, and then obviously you still want to venture into the dungeons for Sefris in particular, but you end up with a lot more reanimation cards in here, which we do have. This is actually probably about as much, maybe a little bit more than the dungeon diving side of it there. So let's talk about some reanimation. So we got Doomed Necromancer for 2 generic and a black. It's 2/2 human cleric mercenary, and you can pay black to tap and sacrifice Doomed Necromancer to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Obsessive Stitcher is 1 generic and a blue and black for a 0/3 human wizard. You can tap it to draw a card and then discard a card, or you can pay 2 generic and black and blue to sacrifice the Obsessive Stitcher to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You're going to see a theme with this, and then most of these are out of the part of the precon as well, so that's kind of how it was designed. Shieldred, I'm not going to read the text word for word. This is the original Shieldred. So she basically lets you reanimate a creature every turn, and then on each of your opponent's turns, they have to sacrifice a creature. Then you got Master of Death for a colorless and blue-black. You get a 3/1 zombie wizard. When it ETBs, you can surveil 2, and then at the beginning of your upkeep, if it's in your graveyard, you may pay 1 life, and if you do, return it to your hand. So not recursion in the sense that it's bringing something else back or to the battlefield, but it does let you continue to bring this card back from the graveyard. Karmic Guide is 3 generic, 2 white for a 2/2 angel, flying, protection from black, with Echo, if you so chose. And then whenever it ETBs, you can return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So not great mana-wise. It is a little bit expensive, but it does recur. You got Eternal Dragon, who is 5 generic and 2 white for a 5/5 with flying. And then you can pay 3 generic and 2 white to return it from your graveyard to your hand. Activate only during your upkeep, or you can plane cycle. So pay 2 to discard it and find a plains, put it into your hand. We got Sun Titan. This one's a classic. I think most people are familiar. But basically, whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you can return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This is a staple in most precons that run the color white. So I think everyone is fairly familiar with Sun Titan at this point. You got the Priest of Fell Rites for a white and a black. You get a 2/2 human warlock. You can tap it to pay 3 life and sack Priest of Fell Rites and return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. And then you can unearth it for 3 generic, a white, and a black. Reassembling Skeleton lets you return it from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped if you pay 1 and a black. And it's a 1/1. Unburial Rites, so now we're out of the creatures, now into the other spells. You can pay 4 generic and a black to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and then you can flash it back for 3 generic and a white. Necromantic Selection is 4 generic and 3 black, a very expensive sorcery, that lets you destroy all creatures, then return a creature card put into the graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. It's a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. And then you exile Necromantic Selection. Obviously, this came in the precon. This is not a stellar card, but it's a board clear / reanimator. And you don't have to necessarily pick your creatures. It's just any creature that was put into a graveyard this way. It's to come back. Victimize, one of my favorites, for black and 2 generic. It's a sorcery that lets you choose 2 target creatures in your graveyard, then you sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. So a 2-for-1 exchange is quite nice, especially with all the recursion we have, because you'll probably get that one back, unless it's a token. Grave Endeavor is 5 generic and 2 black. For an instant, here we go, get the infamous dice rolling. You're going to roll 2 d10s and choose 1 result. You return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to that result. Then each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the other result. So you could theoretically get a creature back with up to 10 +1/+1 counters on it. For 7 mana, you would expect it to be pretty flashy. Again, this is definitely a precon special there, but it is kind of a fun card. And then one more dice rolling card here. So Revivify for 2 generic and a white instant. You roll a d20 and add the number of creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn, which would go well with a couple of the other cards that we've looked at so far. On a 1 to 14, you're going to return all creature cards in your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn to your hand. And on a 15 plus, you're going to return those cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if you suffer from a board wipe, either at your own hand or from somebody else, you have a good chance of, well, you will get at least all the creatures back to your hand if you roll low enough, or could potentially get them back to the battlefield. So Just a nice fun little reaction spell there. Okay, so that's that. So then we're going to get into the next pile here is pretty much just card draw, because it's a really good thing to have, especially with these kind of slower, slightly slower precons. The ability to gain and or maintain a card advantage is very helpful, because that kind of counteracts to a degree some of the expensive cards, because then you're less likely to get stuck with a handful of clunky cards that you can't cast. So first one's Baleful Strix. This one's a classic for blue and black. You get a 1/1 bird with flying and death touch, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. A lot of upside to that card. Then you get Cloud Blazer for 3 generic, a white, and a blue. You get a 2/2 flyer that enters the battlefield, or when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life and draw 2 cards. So for 5 mana, that's, I mean, a 2/2 flyer with 2 life and 2 cards is not terrible for 5 mana. Of course, Muldrifter. This is another classic. I'm getting some reprints lately, so plenty of copies out. Not that it was super expensive to begin with. But you can pay 4 generic and a blue to get a 2/2 flyer that gives you 2 cards when it ETBs, or you can just pay the evoke class to essentially get an ETB trigger if you so desire, or if that matters, and then draw 2 cards. Merfolk Looter, you pay a generic and a blue to get a 1/1 Merfolk Rogue that lets you tap to draw a card and discard a card. It's a nice way to loot your way through your deck there, or at least through the top of your deck. Champion of Wits is a 2 generic and a blue 2/1 Naga Wizard that when it enters the battlefield, you may draw cards equal to its power. And if you do, discard 2 cards. You can also eternalize it, which is where you would get more than 2 cards to draw. Extract Brain is X, blue, and black for a sorcery. Target opponent chooses X cards from their hand. Look at those cards you make. Cast a spell from among them without paying its mana cost. This is not technically a draw spell, but it gives you some card advantage and hoses your opponents, so nothing wrong with that. Arcane Endeavor. Hey, look at that. It's another dice rolling spell. So for 5 generic and 2 blue, you get to cast a sorcery that lets you roll 2 d8s and choose 1 result. You're going to draw cards equal to that result. Then you may cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value less than or equal to the other result from your hand without paying its mana cost. This one is very situational. I would probably take the card draw over the casting, just because this is not like a heavy instant and sorcery deck. It's got a good mix of them, but you would be by no means guaranteed to get that off there. Forbidden Alchemy is 2 generic and a blue for an instant. You can look at the top 4 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, and then you can flash it back for 6 generic and a black. And we don't care as much about cards going into our graveyard because we do have a lot of reanimation. Then we got Faithful Mending for white and a blue. Instant, lets you gain 2 life, draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards, and you can flash this one back for a much more affordable 1 generic, white, and blue. And then we get into our destructive spells, so single and or board clear. First one's Angel of Ruins. This one is 5 generic and 2 white for a 5/7 artifact creature angel with flying. And when it enters the battlefield, you can exile up to 2 target artifacts and or enchantments, or you can plane cycle it to get yourself a planes in your hand. Plague Crafter is 2 generic and a black for a 3/2, and when it ETBs, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker. Each player who can't discards a card, so you are guaranteed to punish your opponents one way or another with this card. Ashen Rider. For 4 generic, 2 white, and 2 black, you get a 5/5 flyer that when it enters the battlefield or dies, exile target permanent. It's very expensive. If you were able to reanimate this, that would be super handy because that's a lot better than paying the 8 mana. However, it's a beefy body on a flyer, and 2 triggers of exiling target permanent is pretty strong. I would not call this like a slam dunk of a card, but from a precon perspective, it's good enough, and exile is pretty strong. And as you'll see, we focus heavily on the exile side of target removal in this deck here. We got Shriekmaw for 4 generic and a black with fear, so this is another one that'll be harder or will have a better chance of getting through for combat damage if it matters. And then whenever it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. So a little bit restrictive. It does have evoke, so you could at least get that ETB for 2 mana. We got Meteor Golem, another classic mainstay of the precon world there, or the budget commander world. So for 7 generic, you get a 3/3 that when it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land permanent and opponent controls. So it is nice that it doesn't specifically target creatures. I got Hostage Taker. This is one of my favorites. I'll use this in my Gruta deck. So for 2 generic, a blue and a black, you get a 2/3 that when it ETBs, exile another target creature or artifact until Hostage Taker leaves the battlefield. And you may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. This can be a really high payoff, or it can be just a quick, I'm going to steal your Soul Ring because I have enough mana to cast this and then pay for the Soul Ring, which I've done several times. So it's a nice versatile card. And then I usually consider counter spells to be single target removal because they are stopping whatever card that a player is attempting to cast. Counter spell is the classic one. So for 2 blue, you get to counter target spell. You got Archmage's Charm. For 3 blue, you can choose one. You can counter target spell. Target player draws 2 cards, which we like. Or you can gain control of target non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. And hey, about that Soul Ring. I don't know if 3 mana for Soul Ring is super great, but if it hoses your opponents, then maybe it's worth it. We got Swords to Plowshares. For 1 white, you get to exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. Vanish into Memory is 2 generic, a white and a blue. For exile target creature, you draw cards equal to that creature's power. At the beginning of the next upkeep, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If you do, discard cards equal to that creature's toughness. So this is a way to sort of remove stuff. I put it in here just because it makes the most sense of all the piles. But there is a downside to it, obviously. So may or may not be useful, but if it can help you get through to the end or just get you a bunch of cards that gets you an answer for something, then it's not the worst. This one, though, is quite expensive relative to other cards that have a similar effect. So for 2 generic, a white and a black, you get to exile target non-land permanent. At least it's non-land permanent, not just creatures, so that is helpful. Despark lets you pay a white and a black to exile target permanent with mana value 4 or greater, which in Commander is not uncommon to run into. Then we got Vindicate, a white, a black, and a generic to destroy target permanent. Again, not specific to creatures, and this could even be a land if you really felt the inclination. Then we got Minimus Containment. So this is an enchantment aura for 2 generic and a white to enchant non-land permanent, and it becomes a treasure. So you're basically turning whatever the target is into a treasure token. And then we got Cataclysmic Gearhulk for 3 generic and 2 white, a 4/5 artifact creature with vigilance. And when it enters the battlefield, each player chooses an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a planeswalker from among non-land permanents they control, then sacrifices the rest. So this is a nice way to do a lopsided board clear if it's not going to negatively affect you, or if you have basically one of each of those. And you get a 4/5 with vigilance on top of it. So not the end of the world for 5 mana. Sunblast Angel is 4 generic and 2 white for a 4/5 angel with flying. When it enters the battlefield, destroy all tapped creatures. Very situational. However, a lot of people like to attack with their creatures. So hopefully the rest of the board has swung out by the time it gets back to you, and this becomes a very nasty card to play on your first main phase. And then, of course, one of the classic board wipes. And this is why one of the cards that I put in here that I would bump it up to a 7, because anytime you pull a Cyclonic Rift out, you are not playing super low power Magic. So I think everyone's familiar with this. It's a very good card. Easily not necessary, especially for what we're trying to do, but I think I had an extra one, so I just threw it in the deck at the time to give it a little bit of oomph. Then you got Path of Peril for 2 black and a generic. So if you pay that cost, you destroy all creatures with mana value 2 or less. Or you can cleave, where you're paying the 4 generic white and black to just destroy all creatures and ignore the words in the brackets there. So definitely there are plenty of other single target removal, plenty of counter spells, plenty of board wipes in these colors that you could add to it. Cyclonic Rift is kind of where I limited myself, but I could have just as easily thrown anything from Farewell to Wrath of God to Damnation to you name it, to Damn in general, like just that card. So I mean, like, there's a lot of options. I stuck mostly with what was already in the precon, but I did add a little bit of spice to it. Okay, so this pile is just stuff that didn't really necessarily fit that great into any of the other piles, so it's a little bit of kind of a hodgepodge, but there's only a couple cards in it. So Rod of Absorption, just kind of a fun card. I feel like you could definitely do some interesting things with this if it's allowed to kind of progress that way. But for 2 generic and a blue, you get an artifact, and whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, exile it instead of putting it into a graveyard as it resolves. Then you can activate the Rod of Absorption for X and tap it to sacrifice the rod, and you may cast any number of spells from among cards exiled with Rod of Absorption with total mana value X or less without paying their mana cost. So that's a very strong ability, but the first ability, I wouldn't discount that as well, because you're just essentially exiling all instants or sorceries, because they stay exiled even if the Rod of Absorption gets blown up. It's not like they suddenly come back to your graveyard. So that is a way to interact with some decks that might want to keep things in the graveyard, or have the ability to recur them. So just something to think about. Lightning Greaves, because why not? And it's part of the precon, so they're already giving it to you. Might as well just keep it. Phantasmal Image is a blue and a generic for a 0/0 illusion. You can have it ETB as a copy of any creature on the battlefield, except it's an illusion in addition to its other types, and it has whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, sacrifice it. So if you're looking for something that has a good ETB effect, or you just want to make a copy of something, I mean, this is very easily a card that you could drop. But we only have so many ways to trigger the venture into the dungeon mechanic, so being able to make copies of some of those creatures is actually fairly handy. Propaganda, again, it's in the precon. Why not just keep it in there? It doesn't necessarily interact or synergize with any of the rest of our deck, except that it helps us stay alive longer. For 2 generic and a blue, you get an enchantment with creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 generic for each creature they control that's attacking you. So this it's very similar to Ghostly Prison. In fact, I think it's pretty much identical. So it's in the precon. I wouldn't take it out. I mean, it's just a good card. There's no reason not to have it. And then you got Viscera Seer for a black and a 1/1 vampire wizard that lets you sacrifice a creature to scry 1. The only reason why I really put this in here is just because sometimes with the amount of recursion we have in the deck, having a sack outlet can create some beneficial opportunities for us. So I think it's worth putting in there. It's certainly not necessary, but depending on which direction you want to go with the deck, it's a pretty good 1-drop. All right, then we have our ramping type spells. So Solemn Simulacrum lets you search for a basic land when he ETBs, and then when he dies, you draw a card. Just a staple. Burner's Chart, you get to sack to find 2 basic lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Again, another staple. 6 mana for 2 lands is a little pricey, but it's not bad for this being a precon or precon power level. Wayfarer's Bauble, for 1 mana you get to pay 2 to sacrifice it and search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped and shuffles. So 2 mana for a land. It's just ways to ramp in colors that don't have as much natural ability to ramp. And then you got the mana rocks. So Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Commander Sphere, Felwar Stone, and Component Pouch, which is a newer one. So for 3 generic, you get an artifact that lets you tap to remove a component counter from the component pouch to add 2 mana of different colors. And then you can tap to roll a d20, and then you put either 1 or 2 component counters on the component pouch. This one is obviously in the precon. I do not think it's a very good card, especially, I mean, maybe in a proliferate deck, this could be okay, but it's very slow for what it does. But I just didn't swap it out because, again, I wasn't looking to min-max the entire deck here. We don't have, like, a Thought Vessel would probably be a nice addition. That would be an easy swap for something like a component pouch, because we are drawing some cards, or we have the potential to draw cards, so getting no maximum hand size could be nice. And then any of the mana rocks that fit, or the fast mana, isn't bad. And then finally we get the lands. So we have a couple more utility-based lands. So you got Riptide Laboratory, which you can tap for a colorless, or you can pay 1 and a blue to return target wizard you control to its owner's hand. So it lets you bounce a wizard back, just either save it or maybe get an additional ETB trigger. We do have, I didn't really call it out, but we do have a decent number of wizards in here. So you would have you would have some good opportunities to make use of this. And Sefris is a wizard, so if it looks like she's about to go down, you could definitely save some mana by not having to pay that commander tax. Just bounce her back. All right, then we got High Market, which you can tap for a generic, or you can sacrifice a creature to gain a life. Again, not great, but it is a sack outlet, albeit very limited, and it plays into the recursion side of it. It's definitely a card you could swap out if you wanted to, but it came in the precon. Then we got Gear Reach Sanitarium for a legendary land that lets you tap to add a colorless, or you can pay 2 to tap, and each player draws a card, then discards a card. So nice little group hug card draw there. Dungeon Descent. This one is essential to the deck. I don't believe it came in the precon. It might have, but regardless, you want this in there because this is one of the dungeon diving cards. I probably should have put this with in that pile, but I forgot. So it's a land that enters tapped, and then you can tap it for a colorless, or you can pay 4 to tap it, to tap an untapped legendary creature you control to venture into the dungeon. Very expensive way to venture into the dungeon, but as you've seen, we don't have a ton of cards in this deck that actually offers that mechanic. So if this is what it takes, then this is what it takes, and it's better than not venturing, if that's what we're trying to do. And then we get into all of our mana generating ones. So you got Command Tower. Anytime you have 2 or more colors in your commander, you want Command Tower. Exotic Orchard is just generally good. Most of the time in a pod, you're gonna have the colors that you need being played across from you. Arcane Sanctum is the poor man's tri-land there that gives you the same effect, just without the cycling or the basic land types. Darkwater Catacombs lets you kind of filter your mana a little bit, and as well as adding an additional one there. Shipwrecked Marsh and Deserted Beach are the 2 of the slow lands, so pretty good for commander. This is a dual land that you will most likely be able to activate fairly quickly. You can add a white if you control an island, or you can add a blue if you control plains, which you probably will. Port Town lets you reveal a plains or island card, and if you don't, then enters tapped, and it's another dual land. This one enters tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. Choked Estuary, same thing as the other one we just read there. So you reveal an island or swamp. If you don't, it enters tapped. Same thing for Sunken Hollow. You got Shattered Sanctum. Oh, I probably should have put this with the other of the slow lands. So that's part of that cycle. And then we got the basics. So we got some plains, we got some swamps, and we got some islands. All right. So that is Sefris. This is probably not going to be the most exciting deck for a lot of people, especially with some of the higher octane ones that I've showcased so far on the channel. But I'm a firm believer in having different power levels of decks, especially if you're going to go play in an environment like a shop or something like that, where you don't have intimate knowledge of what everyone else plays or has the ability to play. And even if you do, it's still good to have some variety so that you can kind of change things up. And hopefully the group as a whole is able to accommodate playing a lower power deck or higher power decks or what have you. But it's just kind of a fun, quirky one that it's not like the more cookie cutter like the Boros equipment decks or something like that that we tend to see one or two a year of from the precon side. So it's kind of an interesting mechanic. I like the dungeon diving. I think it's kind of a fun way to go. Similar to Fortell, like I wish that there was more depth to the mechanics, because I think that they are actually really cool. I know I mentioned it a couple times, but I really like Fortell a lot. I think that would be really fun to look at in more detail. I do like that precon as well from Kaldheim, the one that focused more on that side of it. So yeah, that's it. There's a whole myriad of ways you could tweak this deck to improve it, to increase the power level. I don't know if it's necessarily worth it. If you're looking to build a powerful deck, I probably just wouldn't even start with this one, because there's other ways to do it, unless you really like a challenge. Like you want to take a deck that's not inherently powerful and make it as powerful as possible. But if you're just looking to spice up a precon that's got some kind of fun, cool, quirky mechanics, then yeah, this is a great way to do it. I think AFR and Baldur's Gate both added some pretty interesting mechanics that we don't see outside of that D&D sphere, in terms of the dice rolling, which I know is kind of a dirty phrase for a lot of people, but I think it's kind of fun. And then the dungeon diving, either through this or through the initiative with Baldur's Gate. So yeah, hope everyone enjoyed that. As always, throw some likes down there if you liked it. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. If you're watching this, obviously you are aware that this happens on a Saturday, because that's most likely, because that's when I post them. I guess you could watch it at any point in the week after I've posted it, but they do release on Saturdays, and then Tuesdays and Thursdays we do pack cracking / box breaks, where we're opening up different sealed product for Magic the Gathering. Yeah, so if you want to catch that as it's coming out, please subscribe, because we do that 3 times a week right now with these different with the 2 different types of videos that we're putting out. And then, as always, throw some comments down there. We had some great conversations in almost all of the Commander decks, because a lot of people play a lot of Commander. It's the most popular format, and it's really cool to talk to people about how the way they craft it, or the way they've seen it played and stuff like that. Because, as I said in the beginning, I'm by no means an expert. I do this for fun, and I have large gaps in my Magic the Gathering history, so I just am not aware of a lot of cards. And no matter how much you get into like Scryfall or EDH Rec or some of those other Moxfield, some of those other sites that are tools to enable your deck creation, it's still too easy to miss stuff. Not every card that works for a deck necessarily percolates to the top of those sites lists. So, because I know I definitely have added cards that don't even show up on some of the top cards for each of those different sites there. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, and until next time.